And it's chaos.
It's fully now.
It's not better.
No, because you said it's fully now. Look.
That's all right. That's okay.
It's not.
We got there in the end.
It is.
I think it's secure anyway. Yeah.
Hello, Brenda.
Hello. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you. How's your man?
Well as can be expected. Hang on.
Oh, he's up. I didn't realise he was up.
Oh, yeah.
Why can't I get?
A lot of people with their videos off. That may be purposefully, in which case fine. But if we'd like to see you, then please put your videos on.
Yes.
Which green is a cherry orchard.
Right.
Yeah.
Cherry orchard, cherry blossom. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Video.
Yeah.
That's better, Sue. Well done.
So, people have combed their hair and they're coming in.
Oh yeah, that could be it.
Yeah, are you okay with?
Yeah,
I've got
fine.
leg room.
Yeah, no, I'm fine, thank you.
Hello, Brian.
It's Judy then.
That's what they're all.
That's Judy. Hello, Judy.
Hi, Judy.
Yeah.
Hello, Judy.
She's like a sprite in the amongst the trees.
What are you doing to Judy, Martin?
Yeah, well, I like to try and keep her under control. It's a bit of a
Best of luck with that one.
Actually, I think I might change that background, Judy, because your coat
Right.
wasn't.
See what-
Start now.
Let's see if.
Too many people, isn't it?
Judy.
Oh, this isn't on there.
Look, should have on the screen one thing.
Yeah, yeah.
They've got the videos up. Yes, sure. He's controlling it. So
Hi, can you see me?
no.
No,
No.
No, I've never done it before, so I don't know how do I get in. I can see all you, but I
Who are
No.
you?
pardon.
Yeah.
I'm sitting on the
Are
sofa.
you Pearl?
Pardon?
Are you Pearl?
No, I'm not Pearl. I'm Kat.
actually watching like palm trees.
I'm Kat.
No,
I'm
Brad and Ken standing beside us.
Oh dear. Yes, I'm
I'm-
gonna have how it
I'm
works.
Patricia.
How do I
Oh,
finish
my.
this? I think she does that. Hers on her phone.
Everybody now.
She's got a fancier phone than me or something. Somebody's video. I can't see, you see.
He's back.
I'm
Hello.
going to be recording. I'm recording this, so if anybody misses it, I can send it to them afterwards.
Yeah, I'd wait to record it, but
Good idea.
iPad 2, you need to find something called video and actually turn it on.
Where is it? On the iPad.
On the iPad, you'll find
Top
it.
of your screen.
Yeah,
Okay, bear with me.
it should have a line through it.
Right at the top on right hand side.
Yeah, it's different on various computers and iPads and phones.
This is an iPad.
It's top right, is it? Thank you for that.
That's okay.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah.
I'll give up. We'll get there eventually.
Any good?
We got another 10 minutes anyway, so.
We would have had that.
I've switched video on.
Sorry.
Yeah. Just had some
We're
porridge
still
with
not
milk
seeing
on it.
you,
No,
unfortunately.
that's some cereal. I did a stupid thing. It was bananas yesterday. And I didn't notice how green they are. I work hard. So I have to get some more today. They're really good. I was in such a rush because I knew Matthew wanted to get back from Farrow. So I sort of picked them up. When I got back, great, rock hard.
All those people looked in, but they're not.
I've got a few coming in now.
Good, good,
Can you
good.
see me now? Can you
Afraid
see
not.
me?
Not yet.
I put my video on and it's saying recording, so
Okay. Well, unfortunately, it's we're not seeing your picture, but we can hear you beautifully.
that's fine.
I know.
I don't know whether it's the host that gets little pictures of everybody around the screen, because I mean, I
Well, I
don't
thought
know
so.
how, I don't
When,
know how you do it.
when the National Trust woman, what's her name? Carol.
Carol,
she can
gets
see everybody, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends what device you're on as far as the answer to that one
Mm.
is. An iPad, you can only see about 6, I think. With a computer, you can see everybody. There you go. Yeah, we can hear you.
Good.
I'm getting 25 pictures to a screen.
25 to a screen, yes. You'll have an arrow going the left and right to pick up the others.
Yeah, to pick up the other screen.
I don't know.
But I see, I got a pair of Muscrofts there, but they haven't got a picture.
There's a lot of people not using video.
I've lost it.
Yes, she's having it.
Where's the
Hey.
Brenda's picture gone?
I've
We
put my
don't know.
video on.
We've lost the picture. I don't know.
Blimey, Brian.
Is he playing again?
We'll get there eventually.
Very
There we
well.
are.
We're okay.
Well done.
What I can't sort out is how to make my picture with the blossom, fill the whole screen.
Just touch it. Just touch it.
You may have to go to the top right and look at view. Under view, you can change it to speaker view, and that will become the whole picture.
Oh, never mind. Just get going.
Everyone's the Martin, don't they?
I've got all sorts. I've got Linda now.
There you are.
The last one.
Martin.
Your full screen.
We've got both of them.
Somebody else. God's sake. I give up.
Yeah, when you put on speaker view, it's the last person to speak. So whoever the computer is
see.
picking up, as in case myself now, that's who it'll show. So when
Right,
I mute everybody, it'll only be Judy.
It's going to mute us all.
Right.
Yeah, afraid so. Sorry.
Always have
Oh,
to.
the power. Yeah. It is magic, isn't it?
That's a label.
Somebody's got to help her. Helpful people in the background.
She's got her own computer now in her house.
Yeah, I watched that one.
Supposed to
You
start
may
10.
I've got another 6 minutes to go.
Oh, I thought it was 10 o'clock.
No.
Oh, after the year's recording, yeah.
Is my voice?
Yeah,
Oh. Oh, right.
because Jonathan's co-hosting for me, so that there'll be people to admit when I'm concentrating on you after we've got going.
Oh, promise again.
Keep faffing about with it. I wish you wouldn't, honestly.
There's Beryl with a
Come
nice
on, Brenda, get it together.
Morning, Beryl.
Morning.
No sound.
If you want to temporarily take sound off, you can use the space bar. If you push the space bar down, if you're using your computer, it'll take your sound on.
Blimey, hurry up.
Phil got 5 small and died and made him king.
Hi, Phil.
Martin, probably. No, amputated or
Yeah.
What?
It's gonna be all right, you know, Judy.
I do.
Martin,
Very consistent.
if I hit mute all, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
I'm letting people talk at the moment, but when I hit mute all, you'll have to
Be good.
unmute.
Make it easier to make it easier for Phil to hear, won't it?
Indeed.
And Beryl's unmuted now. Well done, Beryl.
Yes, made it.
Having unmuted, I'm just about to mute you, but never mind.
It's amazing what we can learn, isn't it?
Mhm.
Where's
Just trying to help at the moment,
Mhm.
but not in proportion.
Yes.
We've got quite a lot actually. I haven't got
Yes. You want to-
Make sure it's on.
You are, look, the names are coming up. Okay. Do you want to come and sit here?
Yes, okay. You're the
That's an idea. Choose one that's very good.
He's in the garden.
nice that man actually.
Yeah.
Kind of it.
So
No. Let's see where. Yes.
There you are at the top.
Yes. You're always to the right of the speaker.
So they're not taking a picture of you as you are now.
No, it's the one that you post at the time you register for Zoom.
Oh, they're moving about, though, aren't they?
Yes. Well, they do. That's his spot.
You see us.
Yeah.
this is going ahead to with Martin and Peter Cooley.
Martin Peter
Peter Cooley.
Peter Cooley.
Yeah.
Used to come in David before David started.
No,
He'd come around in the cupboard.
I've muted all, Martin. You'll need to unmute yourself. That's it. Well done.
Right, we got just a couple of minutes to go.
Yep.
We're up to 53, 54. Once Judy's started, Jonathan, perhaps you'll admit all the latecomers.
Yes, indeed, as I am doing at the moment. Yep, surely will.
Tell me, what else can go wrong with our machine?
Oh
Hey?
dear.
There's several others not on.
Mm.
There's Jim Connolly. It's nice to see who's joined us. Nobody can hear us here. There's Jim. I'll make one over the road. Good wave at him.
Morning, Martin.
Good morning. Good morning, Janet.
I like your background.
Yes, Judy's chose it from the available ones I've got.
It's
I
lovely.
What is that?
I offered,
Why are we not running?
Oh, bother.
Oh,
Hey.
we're-
Sorry, Martin, I've just muted you. Didn't mean to. Apologies.
I lost him as well.
Disappeared altogether. God.
I'll move the chair over here. Right, everybody, I think it's 10:15. We'll make a start. Welcome. It is
We're in trouble
exciting,
with our internet, aren't we?
if a bit nerve-wracking. I hope it goes well, but if you know anybody that wasn't able to join us this morning, then do let me know, because I'm recording it and I can send them a copy of it. I've given Judy a weak cup of tea. I got a special chair for her to sit on. She's suited and booted and ready to go. I said, how long are you going to talk for, Judy? And the answer was interesting. Something like, she's not sure. So it may be that we'll be going till about 11:10, 11:15, something like that. But if we finished, we'll stop. At the end, I'll get all the mics open so that you can ask Judy questions if you like. And then right at the end, I'll talk about the next stage. So I'll just change the chairs over. Judy's got shorter legs than me. And then we'll make a start. Right, we'll stand in the corner there. Oh. See if that one works for you.
I'm going to take it
Put it forward. Forward as far as you want to.
Otherwise I can sort of see books and things, and notes and things.
That's it, you go.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you again after all this time. And I hope you're all right. I hope everybody that's watching is all right and hasn't had any awful reactions to their jabs. And I'm assuming that you have all had your jabs. But today's a special day for the country as well as, but more importantly, we're starting our history lectures again. So, straight in, the reign of George III. I thought we'd have a change from social and economic history. You've all been very patient and very good, but I know it isn't everybody's cup of tea. So we're getting back to kings and queens and personalities and trying to explain what makes people tick, which is something that modern historians are very good at explaining. It didn't used to be possible. I don't think when we learned our history at school that our teachers went into that sort of detail, because that wasn't the kind of history that was being taught when we were young. It tended to be facts. So there's speculation as well as facts in this particular lecture or class. So George III, most people think, oh, George III, he's the mad one, the mad king, and that's it. That's what they know about George III, which is very unfortunate because he reigned for such a long time. That can't be fair. It can't be a fair assessment of him, that he lived a long time and he was mad. And that's all we seem to understand about him. That really is not a fair way of evaluating his life and his reign. But of course, a mad king sort of hits the headlines. It's a bit like the king in the car park. It's all people all seem to know about Richard III, that his body was found in a car park. So hopefully you'll feel differently about George III when we've done these, it's only the preliminary one we're doing today, his early life and the effect his early life had on his personality and his character and his outlook on life. So, born 24th of May or the 4th of June, because how could he have been born on two different occasions? Some of you will know, probably a lot of you will know, that the calendar was adjusted in 1752, and we lost 12 days, and there were actually riots all over the country because people thought they were being cheated of 12 days of their life. There were violent riots in some places, people very, very upset, very indignant, because of course there wasn't anybody to explain that they weren't losing actual days. It was a readjustment of the calendar from Julian to Gregorian. So he was born in London, Norfolk House, St James's Square, London, right in the centre of the West End. His father was Frederick, the Prince of Wales. His mother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, and grandfather was, of course, George II. George had 9 siblings, so the Hanoverians, unlike the Stuarts and the Tudors, were very prolific, very fertile. And he was homeschooled via tutors. Now, there's a sort of myth or a legend or a belief that he was ill-educated. And he wasn't. He had, particularly for that particular time, really good tutors and a wide range of subjects. It wasn't that he had bad tutors, it was that he was a premature baby. He was born, it was a 7-month baby. Bearing in mind that they didn't have incubators in those days, and they didn't have the oxygen and all the equipment that they need today for premature babies. It was actually a miracle that he survived, although he was a reasonable weight. But it isn't so much, as you all know, it's not to do with weight, it's to do with maturity. When the baby's born, there are problems of various kinds. But he had a very good wet nurse, and she took responsibility for him, and she also took the credit. She was a very outspoken woman, and she took the credit for having sort of reared him and made him strong and healthy. But I think we need to bear that in mind, that premature children sometimes do have problems. I've got 2, a lot of you will know, but my granddaughters were very, very premature, extremely premature, a 5.5-month pregnancy. So, but 2 months in the 18th century was a lot. So bear that in mind as he grows up, that there may have been some slight problems. What's called cognitive impairment, which is posh phrase for possibly a little bit behind in understanding. But he did have good tutors. He was a slow pupil. He found reading difficult. We believe he didn't read until he was 7. But he did have a very strong personality. He did persist, and he was diligent. His tutors all said that he was a diligent pupil, and he was hardworking, and he liked academic subjects, although he wasn't very good at them. So he had a striving, a yearning to be better at his lessons than he actually was. So bear that in mind, because that is hard for children, to know that they could be, they want to be better, but they haven't got the capacity to be better. But they have the ambition to be better, but then they're frustrated when it doesn't happen. He grew up wanting to know how things worked. He became very interested later in clocks and watches. He wanted to know how they worked, and became quite good at taking them to pieces and putting them back together again. Interestingly, having been a premature baby, he grew up, all the Hanoverians had a problem with their weight. Well, it's a bit general, but on the whole, particularly the men, had a problem with weight. Stocky in build, so George grew up to be stocky in build, put on weight easily, very blonde hair, very Germanic, big protuberant blue-grey eyes, very fine skin and high colour, which has actually come down in our royal family if you look at Prince Charles. Now, in personality, George was shy and unsure of himself, but whether that was an actual personality issue or whether it was his upbringing and the fact that he felt insecure and unsure of himself, we'll investigate that in shortly. He was very afraid of making mistakes, conscious of his limitations, kind. He was always very kind. When he grew up, he was a kind person, very well-meaning, excitable, and very affectionate, but stubborn and immature. So a sort of whole package of characteristics which we will unpick later. Some are going to benefit him and some are definitely not going to be helpful when he becomes king. His problems were exacerbated by the fact that his father died when George was 13. Now, we know an awful lot now about the effect of bereavement on families. In the 18th century, not so much known, and certainly not very much understanding shown. Children were just expected to get on with it, as adults were. But we know now that to lose his father, who had been very, very affectionate and caring and loving, to lose his father at the age of 13, from George's point of view, was a disaster. Consequently, he was dominated by his mother, Princess Augusta, and Lord Bute, who was an up-and-coming MP, very ambitious and very significant. There were all sorts of horrible rumours about the relationship between Princess Augusta and Lord Bute. We'll come back to that. And thank you, Martin. I've just been given a cup of tea. I mean, a cup of water, not tea. A glass of water. She'd regooned her son into accepting a rigid, very Germanic attitude to religion. And I've put blinkered Lutheranism, and that isn't because I'm biased in any way. She gave him a crushing sense of duty and patriotism. You might say, well, that's a good thing. He's going to be the future King of England. But she wasn't a very imaginative woman. She wasn't a very kind woman. His father had supplied the kindness and the understanding. And Augusta had her own agenda. She was very ambitious for herself. She was a selfish woman. And although probably quite intelligent, she didn't understand people. She didn't understand certainly didn't understand her son. She found him very irritating because he was slow, ponderous, took a long time to think about things before he would answer questions, for example. He didn't answer readily. And he was shy and he hung his head. You could say, well, a typical adolescent. But in those days, they didn't seem to acknowledge adolescence. You were either a child or you were an adult. They didn't seem to accept that there was anything in between that you made allowances for. And George certainly found this period of his upbringing very, very difficult, missing his father, not being shown very much sympathy by anybody, because they didn't in those days. And by the time he was 13, he was well aware that he wasn't matching up to people's expectations, that he was trying his best, but his best wasn't good enough. And that's an awful feeling for a child to have, for an adolescent boy, particularly for an adolescent boy, to know that they're not matching up. So what we would say now, we would describe it as problems of self-esteem. And having been a teacher, as I know several of you were teachers, it's very difficult to deal with to try and boost a child's confidence in themselves when it's lacking. It's very hard to sort of put it back and give them self-confidence and give them courage and self-awareness. Well, it's not self-awareness, they've got self-awareness. They think they're rubbish at everything. And that's an awful thing for a child to feel, that people are judging them, people are finding fault with them. And certainly Princess Augusta was probably a little bit like the late lamented Duke of Edinburgh. I don't know what you thought about the coverage of the Duke of Edinburgh, but they played down his faults, of course, because he died. And we have a tradition in this country that you don't speak ill of the dead, well, not immediately anyway. And nobody addressed this problem, which we know that existed, that Prince Philip didn't think a great deal of his son Charles, because they're very, very different. And the same situation arose with Princess Augusta and her son. She just didn't understand him, so she bullied him and criticised him, which was the very last thing that he needed, because he was already very self-critical, and he needed to be encouraged and boosted and complimented when he did something well, and that simply wasn't happening. He was being judged and found fault with, and so he became very, very quiet, hung his head a lot, didn't join in when other people were talking, and was very self-critical, found fault with himself all the time. He needed affection. So there were problems as he got older, went into adolescence. There were rumours that he secretly married a young Quaker woman called Hannah Lightfoot. There's no doubt that he was in love with her. He was a very affectionate young man with lots of love to give, not being given much love, but lots to give. She was the daughter of a tradesman from the what we now call Dockland. So a very unsuitable background. There was talk at the time, and of course since, of 3 illegitimate children. You know, the gossip of the time was that they were secretly, well, they hadn't got secretly married, they were secretly meeting, and she managed to produce 3 illegitimate children. I mean, quite ridiculous, really, think about it. As she was very, very virtuous, she was a very, very, very conscientious Quaker. She was a very good Christian girl. There's very, very little, well, absolutely no likelihood that she would have done anything like marrying in secret. She just wouldn't have done that. But there was lots of gossip at the time, with the equivalent of what we call journalists, investigative journalists, and cartoonists having a field day. So Princess Augusta, panicked at the thought that her son was becoming sexually aware, another problem to deal with. So bad enough that he wasn't very good at his studies and that he was shy and awkward. But now, I mean, imagine the woman thinking, oh, help, what do I do with this? This is another problem I've got to deal with. We must get him married as soon as possible. Deal with these urges that he's feeling. We must get this sorted. Without any reference to her son, you know, I mean, of course, arranged marriages were the order of the day for royalty, but Augusta was such a dominant, opinionated woman, it didn't seem to occur to her to speak to her son about what his feelings or what he would like. So we know that she was looking for a suitable consort, pardon me, for years before she actually found somebody. So her son was 22 before she actually found the suitable princess. The reason that she was so dominant was partly her personality, And also the fact that she felt the responsibility of bringing up the future heir to the throne. She felt that very, very much indeed, and we can feel perhaps some sympathy for her, but she wasn't English, she was German. And she took this issue very, very much to heart, but compounded the problem by criticising her son as he was growing older. Again, no compliments. Not if he did do something well, she didn't say, "Well, you did that really well," and try and cheer him up. He was sort of left to his own devices really when it came to encouragement. He really wasn't getting any encouragement. 1760, Prince George's grandfather died suddenly of what they described in those days of an apoplexy. We would call it a stroke. Famously in the loo. He was in the loo, and the valet suddenly heard a loud bump and a thud and knocked on the door of the privy. No answer. Are you all right? No answer. Went in, and the king was unconscious, still alive but unconscious, but died later that day. So George succeeded to the throne at the age of 22, but he was immature. Not physically, certainly not physically, but in terms of development, emotional, the sort of mental development, he was immature and very aware of it. Sadly, very aware that he was faced with this massive responsibility, and that his tutors and his mother and Lord Bute found him lacking. However, he made a very good impression to begin with. He had been brought up to have beautiful manners, and once he'd learned something, he retained it. He learned but slowly, but he did remember what he'd been told. And so Horace Walpole, who was a kind of journalist, we would describe him as a journalist and a writer, gave us this wonderful description of George, the new king, George III, the age of 22, his first levee, which was something we'd copied from the court of, you might know, Louis XIV. Everybody, all the courts in Europe seem to copy what Louis XIV had done. So that's why it's got a French name, levee. And we'd perhaps call it today a sort of court walkabout, where the king the monarch would walk about among his courtiers and speak to them and say, ask questions and the kind of thing our royal family are very good at doing. And everybody looking at George thinking, well, will he be able to do this? He's so shy. He's not used to speaking first. He's used to people speaking to him, and then he spends rather a long time thinking of an answer, and people think that he's stupid. Is he really stupid, or will this be embarrassing? Most people thinking, yeah, this is going to be awful. This is going to be so embarrassing. And you imagine people's hearts will start beating quickly, thinking, well, you know, how will we be expected to cover up for his inability to do this walkabout and speaking spontaneously? However, this is the description. His person is tall and full of dignity, his complexion florid and good-natured. Rather funny to put those two together, florid and good-natured. His manner graceful and obliging. I saw him yesterday and was surprised to find the levee had lost so entirely the air of the lion's den. And the next bit is interesting, because George II has now died. People feel free to say what they really thought about the way he behaved. The sovereign does not stand on one spot with his eyes fixed royally on the ground and dropping bits of German news. And clearly that was what George II had done. This is criticism of the previous king. So very brave of Horace Walpole. The previous king's only been dead a short time, and he is criticising the previous king. George II hated these occasions. He also wasn't exactly shy, he was just rude, incredibly rude, and boorish, and made his displeasure known by not mixing and mingling. People had to go up to him and be introduced. He didn't do any walking around and speaking to people, although he knew that was the English tradition. He just didn't do it because he didn't think he didn't want to. And so this is what George, really, this is what George II did. Pardon me. The sovereign does not stand on one spot with his eyes fixed royally on the ground and dropping bits of German news. He walks about and speaks freely to everyone. I saw him afterwards on the throne where he is graceful, sits with dignity, and reads his answers to addressers very well. So that's lovely, isn't it? A lovely description of somebody coping amazingly well with a new situation. And the criticism of the previous king, this inside information that people haven't known before, that that's what the previous king had done. It just being completely boorish and unfriendly. Made it very clear that he actually hated these occasions. He didn't think they were necessary. Why should he have to meet these people? He didn't want to. And George is making a real effort to overcome his shyness and his feelings of inadequacy. Now, after the ending of his Hannah Lightfoot romance, he'd fallen madly in love again. And because he was naive and inexperienced, everybody knew how much in love he was, because this time it was somebody at court, Lady Sarah Lennox, who was a descendant of Charles II through an illegitimate line, of course. 17 years old, a court beauty. She was really considered very, very beautiful, and they in those days it wasn't awful to say somebody was beautiful or ugly or whatever. It was totally acceptable that certain people were, we'd say, celebrities simply because they were beautiful or handsome. They could be, think of two short planks, they could be serial killers, but as long as they were beautiful, either beautiful or handsome, they could make their way in the world. We would say that was wrong, but our culture and our standards have changed, of course, over the centuries. Lady Sarah Lennox was a court beauty, therefore very acceptable. And they met in the grounds of Holland House, which was her home, nearly every day. What the new king loved was walking. So again, there's a link with us. We can sort of relate to that. Not me personally, but a lot of people have walked a great deal during lockdown. And the king loved walking. So that was helpful. He was able to walk over to Lady Sarah Lennox's house, and they would meet in the grounds, which were very beautiful, the grounds of Holland House in London. And they, again, it was a sort of cultural thing, wore peasant costumes. This was something you probably remember Marie Antoinette had introduced, the idea of dressing up as a shepherdess, even though the shepherdess in Marie Antoinette's case was wearing all sorts of silks and satins and lace and flounces, and not really like a shepherdess at all, but he got some actual sheep, which had been carefully washed and groomed so that they weren't dirty, smelly real sheep. Well, they were real sheep, but they'd been sort of manicured and washed and perfumed so that Marie Antoinette had beautiful, nice, clean sheep to sort of play with. But she did have a shepherdess's crook with a lovely pink bow on it, and she would play all day at being a shepherdess. And this idea had caught on. What an elegant pursuit for ladies. What a lovely thing to do. We pretend to be peasants. So the king went along with this because he was a bit immature, and she went along with it, and they met dressed as peasants, and they called it their rustic idyll. walking about in the grounds pretending to be farmers or people getting in the harvest. So very innocent and sweet. Until, of course, Mama found out. And Princess Augusta and Lord Bute, who were controlling the king at this stage, totally controlling him, flew into a panic. They wanted him to marry royalty, preferably, well, certainly German. And Augusta's idea was it must be somebody that she could control, and she didn't think she could control Lady Sarah Lennox, who had a very strong personality, even though she was only 17. And anyway, she was of damaged stock, although she was an aristocrat, and descended from a king. It was on the wrong side of the blanket. So she was not suitable and appropriate to be Queen of England. You can sort of see a sort of pattern for modern royalty, really, that they're still, you know, Camilla wasn't considered suitable for Prince Charles. There's a pattern here of women being vetted very carefully. Will they suit? Will they fit into the royal family? Well, poor Sarah Lennox didn't fit. So Augusta and Lord Bute renewed their efforts to find a suitable consort. She got to be young, got to be German, got to be from somewhere that wasn't going to be any kind of a threat, not a powerful German state. And remember, Germany didn't exist as such in those days. It was all separate little states and principalities and duchies. So they wanted to look for somewhere very inferior in terms of power and size, so that whoever the young lady was, she wouldn't be any kind of threat to Augusta, who was virtually acting as regent for her son. I mean, she was the power base, really. George would do whatever his mother told him to do. He hadn't got the competence to act on his own behalf at this stage. For a 22-year-old, he was really more like a 15-year-old. He was sort of 10 years behind where he should have been. So they did a lot of research into who was suitable, and say that the German royalty seemed to be very prolific. They had lots of choice, and went through all these German princesses who were of marriageable age and rejected one after the other, and then came up with Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And all of a sudden, without any preparation, the betrothal was announced. The bride to be, Sophie Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, later known as just Charlotte. They abandoned the Sophie bit. No one seemed to have a clue regarding where was this place, where on earth was Mecklenburg-Strelitz. They never heard of it. And there were jokes circulating at court, and then there were cartoons, and it sort of went into the reading public. That if you looked it up on an atlas, you might miss it, because that was where the fold in the page was, where the pages were, the fold in the page, and Mecklenburg-Strelitz was so small that you still couldn't find it on an atlas. And even if you did find it, it was really tiny, and Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the written out with a hyphen in the middle, was larger than the principality itself. So there are all sorts of disparaging comments made about what an inferior little, funny little place this was that nobody could find in an atlas or a map of Germany. That was the whole idea. That was the whole idea. That Augusta would not lose her position and the strength of her influence on her son. She was determined that she was going to remain literally the power behind the throne. So they deliberately chose a small, obscure, inferior German state. So they'd been considering her since she was 15. She was now 17. And she obviously wouldn't interfere in politics, and she wouldn't be any kind of rival to her fierce future mother-in-law. She intended to stay in control of her son and in control of politics and all developments in this country. Lady Sarah Lennox, who had been extremely compromised by the romance, the king had made it very clear that he was in love with her, and he sort of virtually proposed in a very shy way on several occasions, only she'd chosen to ignore the signals, but he had made it very clear that he wanted to marry her, and he virtually proposed to her on several occasions. And everybody knew that the king was madly in love with her because he looked at her all the time on court occasions. He just stared at her all the time. So everybody knew it was an absolutely open secret that the king was madly in love with Lady Sarah Lennox, and people were literally waiting for the announcement that they were engaged. So it was pretty humiliating for her to suddenly find in the court, and the first news she had, or anybody had, was an announcement in the court review, the court news, that the betrothal is announced between the King of England and Sophie Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Shock to everybody. All this negotiating been taking place behind the scenes and suddenly burst upon the court and the public. Oh, she was engaged. Wow, when did that happen? Well, it wasn't called engagement, it was called betrothal. It meant you've got to go through with it very quickly. So Charlotte, we call her Charlotte. Charlotte arrived. Not quite the pushover that Augusta had been hoping for. A mind of her own, which she demonstrated quite quickly. So that wasn't quite what Augusta had been hoping for. However, she did take over when it came to what the bride would wear on her wedding day. The same thing happened for the coronation. It was thought that she deliberately made her mark, made her new daughter-in-law aware that she was going to be the boss. Augusta, was going to be the boss, that Charlotte would have no influence or right to choose anything, including what she was going to wear. And that her mother-in-law deliberately chose robes that the poor girl, who was very, very thin, could hardly stand up in order to humiliate her. Now, whether that's true or not, but that just shows the kind of publicity that Augusta was attracting. The journalists of the day, although they weren't called journalists then, the reporters, we'd say call them journalists now. Journalists and reporters had a pretty low opinion of Augusta and her dominating ways. And so they actually said that she'd chosen the outfit for poor Charlotte to wear, very, very heavy robes with lots and lots of fur, so that the poor girl could barely walk. Same for a wedding and same for the coronation. And the wedding was embarrassing because the king, poor George, thwarted the woman he was madly in love with, just kept staring at Lady Sarah Lennox, who was one of the bridesmaids. So that was pretty embarrassing for everybody, all the onlookers. He found it very difficult not to look at the woman he really wanted to marry. Charlotte did become an excellent wife in many ways, an excellent wife and queen. They saw eye to eye on many issues and were totally loyal to their marriage vows, which made a very pleasant change. Together, they produced 15 children, 13 of whom lived to maturity. They agreed on the basics. One, that they would keep their expenditure very modest. They were very aware that their money came from the taxpayers. So that was refreshing, that they were very aware that whatever they spent, somebody else had contributed to that money. It wasn't their money. So they lived in a way very frugally in their own apartments. When when the general public, well, the general public, the people who counted found out about this, there were some very vicious cartoons of the king and queen eating a boiled egg each, and all kinds of signs in the room of frugality, that they hadn't got a fire in the grate, and they had the lamp and it was broken, that they were living in a ridiculously humble way, and it was mocked. It's like they couldn't do right for doing wrong. If they'd been very extravagant, the journalists would have had to go at them for being extravagant. So they tried to live in a simple kind of way and not be extravagant and overspend. And they got it in the neck for that as well. Like, some people are never satisfied. They just want to criticise. They were both aware that they had to court the people, that they couldn't just shut themselves away, although they were both quite shy. They must go out and about and meet people. Charlotte was never popular, but George did become very popular. This is what people forget. They just say, oh yes, Mad King George. He was very, very popular with our ancestors. Very popular. Because, unlike the first two Georges, who were handicapped by their German accents and their German upbringing, of course, he was British, English, and he kept, his mother had actually said, you must emphasise this when you become king. She did have the sense to realise that the first two King Georges had been unpopular because they were so German, and they kept spending so much time in Hanover. Whereas this king had been born in this country, and Augusta, that was one good thing she'd done, emphasise your Britishness, that you're not German, you're British. You're born here and you have British blood in your veins, even though you're sort of 17th, 18th German. Keep on saying how British you are. That will go down well with the public. And it did. And George made a great effort to overcome his shyness and to mix with ordinary people. And that was an absolute, that hadn't really happened since Charles II. Somebody who mixed and mingled, asked questions, like royalty today do. Curious to know how the other half lived. Would walk up to people and talk to them. And that went down very well indeed with our ancestors. He became very popular. And the slight hesitancy in his speech, and the fact that he didn't come over as autocratic or aristocratic and full of himself, that appealed to people, that he seemed slightly awkward and didn't always quite know what to say, but let them talk. That made him very, very popular indeed. He became, in later life, he became known as Farmer George because he was so good at talking to people about all the agricultural developments that we've been studying recently. He was fascinated by all these improvements in different forms of different ways of farming and stock breeding and development of different kinds of seeds for different kinds of soil. He found that it really went right up his street. He loved talking about that and talked knowledgeably. So again, that went down very well indeed. The curious thing, though, was Charlotte, to go back to the Queen, although she went along with the idea of not overspending, did have a very, probably because she came from a very small state in Germany, very strong sense of the dignity and the role of the royal family. She dressed very splendidly, and she dressed her daughters very splendidly. Not that anyone seemed to mind, but it doesn't really go with what I've just told you about their simple diet and their simple lifestyle. She was very much more intellectual than her husband. She loved reading. She didn't get much time to read, but she did love reading. She was very much more intelligent than her husband, and thwarted and frustrated in many ways because she couldn't express that side of her personality. But she had a very powerful way of inflicting her ideas on her ladies in waiting. We've got an excellent insight into life at court from somebody called Fanny Burney. And Fanny Burney was the first really recognised woman author. She wrote a wonderful book called Evelina. She wrote many other books, but Evelina was a bestseller, and then the other books never quite matched up to Evelina. And Fanny Burney, through her father, who was a very eminent doctor in King's Lynn, he had connections. So through networking, we call it today, he got his daughter a job at court. You know, top job, absolutely amazing, through connections he had and friends he had. So again, we're familiar with. And so Fanny became a lady in waiting to Queen Charlotte. Now, Fanny was a writer, and she kept a diary, famous diary. She wrote in it nearly every day. Amazing insights, which we wouldn't otherwise have. Absolutely brilliant primary source material as to what life was like at court. And it was very strange. Very rigid, very unrelaxed. The ladies in waiting had to stand, if necessary, all day in the presence of the royal family. King George didn't inflict this. He was rather, well, not rough and ready, but much more relaxed and casual. It was Queen Charlotte who insisted that ladies in waiting only spoke when they were spoken to, and they must stand waiting. So the term implies lady in waiting. Sometimes they're invited to sit down and do some embroidery or read a book, but mostly they stood in silence by the door. That continued into the reign of Queen Victoria. And possibly, no, not into the reign of no, Queen Alexandra, the consort, didn't insist on that. I think she let people sit down. And eventually, Fanny found that this so awful that it was affecting her health, and she had to give up being a lady in waiting because she was finding it so difficult to maintain the rigidity of the court protocol. She found it really hard. But she kept this wonderful diary and talked about the princesses and how they dressed and what they were like. And she came into contact with obviously the princesses more than the princes. And she was also an eyewitness to the king's mental breakdown. So we know in great detail how that affected the court, how it was kind of hushed up and then and how it developed. So we know that the king it was like a dual role, very outgoing and friendly, but in the court situation, Charlotte again sort of dominated the scene. Charlotte made sure that everything was done very precisely and very exactly, that nobody stepped out of line as far as she was concerned. Kings and queens should not mix and mingle with ordinary people because they lost their magic. So it's a little bit like in the 1970s when they introduced the royal walkabout, and the royal family were filmed, weren't they, doing a barbecue and things. And at the time, somebody said, you shouldn't let the magic of royalty be dispersed in this way. You'll never get it back. You know, if they come off their pedestal sort of thing and prove to be ordinary, then you will have problems with people having republican ideas, saying, well, if they're just ordinary, why are they living in a big palace and why are we spending money on them? And you know, it's not a good idea to prove to everybody that they are ordinary. So I don't really remember that debate about whether the royal family should be ordinary and mix and mingle, but certainly the royal walkabout has continued. And although we know our queen is very shy, she makes the effort to walk along and she did walk along and speak to different people without introduction. You know, the old tradition was that you only spoke to royalty if somebody brought you along and introduced you and said your name, and then the royal person would say a few things to you, a very stilted few things, and then you would walk away, you would be taken away, and somebody else would be brought to the royal. You know, they didn't sort of walk about finding people for themselves. The king loved his children. There's no doubt he loved his children just as his father had loved him. But he played with them and he loved them when they were little. He was much more relaxed with them than Charlotte. She was always on her dignity, always very aware that she was royal. The king was quite happy to get down on his hands and knees and play games with his children and loved them to bits. But, again, a problem. He couldn't bear the idea that they were going to leave the happy family group. He had a very romantic, somewhat sort of Germanic, sentimental idea about childhood, that they were innocent and lovely and that was the best time. It was going to be the best time in their whole lives when they were little, before adolescence. And then in adolescence they would change and they become stroppy and difficult. And so he tried to keep them infantile. He tried to keep them down. And we all know that does not work. It's fatal, really, because what Queen Victoria tried to do with her son or children. She tried to control them all the time, and they either break away or it damages their personalities. And this is when we see the other side of King George, that he had a very, in many ways, a strong personality, but the sign of somebody afraid to relax too much. He wanted to control his children. The sign of somebody lacking self-esteem or self-confidence. And this lack of self-confidence came out again when his children grew up. He wanted to control every aspect of their lives. And he didn't want his daughters to marry. He wanted them all to stay together because it had been so lovely to have all these children. He wanted more. He actually wanted the Queen to have twins. Don't know how he's going to organise that, but that's what he said. He wanted more than 15 children. Charlotte didn't want any more, but he was happily talking about wanting twins. So the family, I don't know whether you've come across this book, which I can recommend. It's called The Strangest Family. And the author is Janice Hadlow, Hadlow. It's a big, fat book, but it's full of juicy royal gossip. So although it's a big book, you find you sort of read it in next to no time because it's full of detail, amazing detail about this strange royal family, and particularly the children and how thwarted they were by their father, refusing, in the case of the sons, he didn't give them very much money. He tried to control them by controlling their allowances and also where they would live. He didn't give them freedom at the right stage and age, so they either broke away like the Prince of Wales, later the Regent, and later George IV, who was a disaster area, really. Exactly the opposite of everything his father believed in. Extravagant, drank too much, had lots of women, the exact opposite of his father, because he'd been so controlled and criticised. George III didn't seem to have very much imagination. He didn't reflect back and think, well, I was criticised and it damaged my personality and made me very, very timid and unsure of myself. I won't do that to my son. He did do the same to his son, and instead of it making the Prince of Wales timid and insecure, he just broke away from his father and did all the things that his father disapproved of. His father was totally loyal to Charlotte. He didn't have mistresses. Lots of mistresses. George III was very careful with money. George IV didn't seem to understand the value of money at all, just spent and spent and spent, was always in debt. George III didn't drink. Well, I mean, he drank a little wine, but he wasn't teetotal, but he drank, but he was very abstemious. Very aware that he'd lose control if he drank. Prince of Wales drank and fell over frequently. And you can see this reflected again with Queen Victoria and her son, Edward, the Prince of Wales. That too much control can either make the child totally crushed and lacking in personality, lacking in courage and confidence, or they break away and become almost like tearaways. Most of the royal sons went to the mad. Became, well, journalists having a field day, cartoonists having a field day, a bad lot. Most of them took mistresses because the father wouldn't arrange marriages for them. He literally wanted to keep the family together. And this sort of childish idea, probably it was his comfort blanket. The idea is he produced all these children and they were all attractive looking and cute when they were little. He was so proud of this big family, but he couldn't bear the fact that they were growing up and they wanted independence. It was anathema to the king to give his children independence. And the same with the girls. He wouldn't arrange marriages for them, so they became embittered spinsters. One of them had an illegitimate child to a footman, so desperate she wanted the child. Really, really, really tragic the way that he tried to control his children. So this book is the story of the children and how and their lives. I mean, some of them did eventually get married, some of the girls, but they were beyond childbearing by the time they got married. They were in their 40s. Unbelievably, he had controlled them all that time. The early years of his reign, many men of affairs had underestimated the king, and they were very surprised at how well he took up the reins of government. Although he seemed nervous and spoke too quickly, he showed great determination and resolution to do the right thing. A lot of people pointed this out, that he was conscientious, he dealt with state papers, although he was a slow reader, he dealt with them. And he fulfilled all his royal duties correctly. They were really surprised and pleased with the way he tackled his responsibilities, and really believed that he was going to be a good king. And he was, as we said, very, very popular for much of his reign. Really enjoying mixing with ordinary people and finding out about their lives. Conscientious when it came to his paperwork. His secretaries were pleased with the valiant way in which he was slow, and they found that irritating, but he did read all his state papers. What was hidden from them, though, was this stubbornness, the obstinacy, and the fact that he had some very strong opinions, which later became a problem, because he was the kind of person that saw changing his mind as a sign of weakness, because he lacked self-esteem. And people who lack self-esteem are often come over as very strong-willed, because they're afraid of seeming weak. That's in their mind all the time. I mustn't seem weak. I mustn't appear to be compliant. I mustn't agree with other people. They'll think I'm stupid. They'll think I'm weak. A little voice in their head all the time, dominating their thought processes. And we need to bear that in mind as we come to the big events in George's life. I mean, the biggest event, of course, was the American colonies. You have to bear in mind that our first empire was largely America. The 13 New England states belonged to Britain. They were our colonies, and George lost them. That's the other thing that people know about George. They know that he was mad, and they know that he lost the American colonies, both of which are negative. But we will look at that.
And he's lampooned in Hamilton, the musical.
Oh yeah, Martin just said he's lampooned in the musical Hamilton as yeah. And that's the problem for poor George. He over the centuries. He's had a bad press. Some of it he deserves, but I'm hoping that we'll get a more balanced view of a man who was sort of damaged almost from birth. What was they damaged? His personality wasn't quite able to cope with the great issues of the day when they came along, but bearing in mind that he was a popular king, much loved by his people, by our ancestors.
Shall we see if there's any questions, Judy?
Yeah, has anybody got any questions? Not too difficult, please.
Can you unmute everyone, Jonathan?
No, they have to do it individually, I'm afraid. So they can either press the space bar if they're on a laptop, or they can unmute. Quite a few people have already done so.
Right. Any questions that you want to put to Judy? They will have seen the pictures as well. So.
They've gone all quiet.
Right.
Good. Well, they're not used to the opportunity of tackling you, madam.
Anybody want to know anything that I haven't covered or I've covered too much, or some of you look as though you'd like to ask a question. We haven't thought of one yet.
Janet Jordan, you like to unmute yourself, Janet? Press the space button.
Okay, now,
Yeah.
where did they live? Where did the family live?
Oh, good question. Various places. They did live in Windsor most of the time.
Windsor Castle.
Windsor Castle, yes.
Oh,
yeah. And that's where eventually he died.
okay.
Yeah, just to put you in the picture, I'm sure you know he had a very long reign. And they preferred Windsor because it was downriver and it was regarded as a much healthier place than living in the centre of London. And Buckingham Palace was nothing like as large as it is now. It was a house, really, rather than a palace. It was only extended in the reign of George IV and then later Edward VII extended Buckingham Palace. We're used to seeing it as it is now and thinking it's always been like that, but it hasn't. It's a house that's been extended over time. So Windsor mainly.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question? About some of his illegitimate children? You know, there's been a programme on the television about the Queen's cousins. Now, would that have anything to do with that? All sort of, family connections. And I just wondered if there was any. I mean, they say it's Queen's cousins, but they seem to live ordinary lives. And I wondered if that was anything to do with some of the illegitimate children.
I didn't see the programme. Which of the cousins did the programme cover?
Well, I didn't actually, I only saw the end of it, but I noticed it was advertised as the Queen's cousins. And I just wondered, because some of them, they didn't really know her. They weren't as cousins exactly. They were just like ordinary people. And I just wondered if it was something, old relationships that went back quite a long time.
Well, I think it was the Romanovs that live in Britain. I think some of the Prince Philip's family live in the south of England, but they also focused on the Bowes Lions, and particularly yes. And there was a very ordinary lady living in East Anglia somewhere with a little corner shop.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And you just wonder where if there's illegitimacy around. Where,
I don't think they were.
There must be relations to the royal family.
Well, yes.
Interesting. Anyway, the whole thing's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
But the Bowes Lions are interesting. Can I just share something with you?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes.
No, it's not nothing but it's not naughty. My daughter and son-in-law used to live within sight of the place where the Queen Mother was brought up. Some people think she was born there, but the question now is was born in London or in this particular house in Hertfordshire. So they could see this house from where they lived in the winter anyway, before the trees got leaves on. And we went to the little village pub. The village was called Whitwell in Hertfordshire. So miles from anywhere. Anyway, we went to the pub and we were sitting there quite happily talking, just my son-in-law, daughter, husband and myself sitting there. And this young man, rather heavy-set young man, came in with a large dog, looked a bit uncomfortable, and very much the Green Welly Brigade. He got Green Wellies. He looked as though he's pretending to be an aristocrat. But it turned out he was an aristocrat, but he was also dressed the part, you know, he got the barber and the wellies and the dog. I looked a bit uncomfortable, and my daughter sort of nudged me in the ribs and said, "Oh dear." I don't know what she's saying. I thought he looked quite pleasant. And my son-in-law was very friendly, said, so this young man looking very hesitant and said, do you want to come over? Do you want to come over? And I said, do you know him? And he said, yes, I know him. Yes, he's called Simon. Anyway, he sat down, and he's very awkward. He kept, every time there was a lull in the conversation, he spoke to the dog. It was been as good as gold, and was sort of lying under the table, absolutely, with his face on its paws, being absolutely wonderful, a retriever. And he would say, down, girl, down. Why is he saying that? The poor thing is down and behaving himself. Why did he speaking to the dog? It was because he was shy. It's very awkward, very possible. It's very awkward conversation. How are you? And then Harry sort of said, well, this is my mother-in-law, Judy, and this is my father-in-law, Dave. How do you do? I'm very pleased to meet you. And where do you live? And this slight stammer, this slight hesitancy, well, where do you live? And Sutton Coldfield. Oh, Sutton Coldfield. I've never been to Sutton Coldfield. I thought, no, I bet you haven't. Far from the south, you probably think you get eaten if you go any further north than Watford Gap. This went on. Very awkward conversation. And Catherine looking at me, my daughter looking at me very meaningfully, but I didn't quite know what she meant. Sort of looking at me very, very meaningfully while we went through kind of stumbling conversation. But beautiful manners. You know, what would you like to drink? Anything you like at all. What would you like to drink? We said, well, we're all right. We've got our drinks, thank you. And well, I must get the next round in. I must get the next round in. So he was lovely and friendly, but very awkward. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he asked lots of questions, and then my daughter said, and how are you? And oh no, coming along all right. And he didn't have very much conversation, let's put it that way. Anyway, finally he went, and we all sort of heaved a sigh of relief because he really had been quite awkward. And yet we felt sort of sorry for him because he was obviously sort of desperate to please us. Anyway, after he'd gone, Harry said, you know who that was? And obviously we said no. The Queen's cousin, Simon Bowes-Lyon. Oh. It was like somebody in a play playing the part of an awkward aristocrat that was making a huge effort to be really friendly with the plebs.
Right.
He was a real sweetheart. Oh, it was awkward. It was there about, I should say, well over half an hour, but it seemed like 2 hours. I say that I think he was, I don't know about that. You know, the ball of the conversation ball wasn't being kind of thrown back and forth. It was like us trying to think of something to say to him, and then he was trying desperately to think of something to say back. But quite often he was just talking to the dog. telling the dog to behave, and the poor dog.
Very shy young man, eh?
Well-behaved dog you've ever come across in your life. Yes, he was shy and awkward. he's taken over the estate. This is many years ago now, but he's taken over the estate. I keep thinking, gosh, but poor thing. I felt really sorry for him, thinking how awkward he was.
We'll have to be careful next time, Judy, when I do the illustrations, not to indulge ourselves too much with too many rude cartoons, because there are so many cartoons online that we could circulate. So we'll.
Field day for cartoonists. There were 3 great cartoonists, all busy, all trying to outdo each other, and how rude they could be about the various members of the royal family. And they really got their knife into the Prince of Wales, of course, showing him as the Prince of Wales as a whale. I mean, they're so crude, some of them, amazing that they were allowed to get through. There was no censorship, really, in those days at all. It was. We were so proud of being the land of the free, the land of liberty, that some of the cartoons are really outrageous.
I shall be very controlled over the ones that I select. Thank you, Judy. Just change seats a moment.
Yeah, lovely to see you all. Lovely, really lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Have a great time. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
That felt almost like normal.
Yes.
We thought we would do these fortnightly, but the first fortnight in 2 months' time is a bank holiday. So if there's general agreement, and I shan't ask you, you'll have to tell me if you don't want me to do it, I'll arrange another Zoom meeting for the 7th of June. Judy will prepare a set of notes, and I'll see if we can find some illustrations to go with it, and we'll have another Monday morning.
Lovely.
Yes, lovely.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for supporting it.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Very good.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
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 everyone. Thank you.